Reading from the Barbri outline for real property, page 107, deeds, form and content. Transfer of title to an interest in real property occasionally occurs through operation of law, but in most circumstances, transfer can be accomplished only by a deed that satisfies various formalities required by statute. 1. Formalities. A. Statute of Frauds. The Statute of Frauds requires that a deed be in writing and signed by the grantor. B. Description of land and parties. A deed must identify the land. The description need not be formal, and it may incorporate extrinsic information, but it must be unambiguous. The parties, grantor and grantee, must also be identified. This may be done by name or by describing them in some other way. For example, I grant this land to my eldest daughter, or I convey this land to the present members of the law review at State University. If the deed is delivered with the identity of the grantee left blank, the courts will presume that the person taking delivery has authority to fill in the name of the grantee, and if she does so, the deed is valid. But if the land description is left blank, no such authority is presumed, and the deed is void unless the grantee was explicitly given authority to fill in the description and did so. C. Words of intent. The deed must evidence an intention to transfer realty, but technical words are unnecessary. The word grant by itself is sufficient in many states. D. Considerations not required. The deed need not recite any consideration, nor must any consideration pass in order to make a deed valid. A deed may validly convey real property by inter vivos gift, so long as the following requirements are met. Romanet 1, donative intent, Romanet 2, delivery, and Romanet 3, acceptance. E. Seal is unnecessary. A seal is unnecessary on a deed. F. Attestation and acknowledgement generally unnecessary. Attestation by witnesses is generally unnecessary, as is an acknowledgement. But note, either or both might be required for the deed to be recorded. And G. Signature. A deed must be signed by the grantor. The grantor may designate an agent to sign on the grantor's behalf, but if the signing is not done in the grantor's presence, Statute of Frauds generally requires that the agent's authority be written. In the case of deeds by corporations, statutes usually provide for execution by 2 officers of the corporation and the affixing of the corporation's seal. If the deed represents a conveyance of all or a substantial part of the corporation's assets, a resolution of the board of directors approving the transfer may be necessary. The grantee's signature is not necessary, even if the deed contains covenants on her part. Her acceptance of the deed, called a deed poll, when signed only by the grantor, is sufficient to make the covenants enforceable. So the formalities of a deed, as a reminder, under the Statute of Frauds, is that it must be in writing. It must include a description of the land as well as the parties and the words of intent such as grant. However, the following is not necessary for a deed to be valid, and that is consideration, seal, attestation, and acknowledgement, which is notary, and signature of the grantee. However, a deed must be signed by the grantor. 2. Defective deeds and fraudulent conveyances. Void and voidable deeds. A deed that is defective may be either void or voidable. Void implies that the deed will be set aside by the court even if the property is passed to a bona fide purchaser. Voidable implies that the deed will be set aside only if the property is not passed to a bona fide purchaser. Void deeds. Deeds considered void include those that are forged, were never delivered, were issued to a non-existent grantee, for example, a grantee who is in fact dead at the time of the delivery, or a corporation that has not yet been legally formed, or were obtained by fraud in the factum. For example, the grantor was deceived and did not realize that he was executing a deed. Voidable deeds are deeds considered voidable? Deeds considered voidable include those executed by persons younger than the age of majority or who otherwise lack capacity because of insanity, and deeds obtained through fraud in the inducement, duress, undue influence, mistake, and breach of fiduciary duty. B. Fraudulent conveyances. When a deed complies with the required formalities mentioned above, it may be set aside by the grantor's creditors if it is a fraudulent conveyance. Under the Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act, which nearly all states have adopted, a conveyance is fraudulent if it is made Romanet 1 with actual intent to hinder, delay, or defraud any creditor of the grantor, or Romanet 2 without receiving a reasonably equivalent value in exchange for the transferor, and the debtor was insolvent or became insolvent as a result of the transfer. However, the deed will not be set aside as against any grantee who took in good faith and paid reasonably equivalent value. 3. Description of land conveyed. In land contracts and deeds, property may be described in various ways. For example, by reference to a government survey, by metes and bounds, by courses and angles, by references to a recorded plat, by reference to adjacent properties, by the name of the property, or by a street and number system. A. Sufficient description provides a good lead. A description is sufficient if it provides a good lead as to the identity of the property sought to be conveyed. Example, a conveyance of all my land or all my land in Alameda County provides a sufficient lead. The intention of the grantor is clear, and the meaning of the intention can be proved without difficulty by checking the land records in Alameda County. Insufficient description. Title remains in grantor. If the description is too indefinite, title remains in the grantor, subject to the possibility of a suit for reformation of the deed. Example, a conveyance of 1 acre off the western end of my 30-acre tract. The 30-acre tract being adequately described would probably fail for certainty. Off the western end is too vague to ascertain which acre, and the admission of parole evidence here would be considered a violation of the statute of frauds. C. Parole evidence admissible to clear up ambiguity. The general rule is that parole evidence is admissible to explain or supplement a written description or to clear up an ambiguity. If there is a patent ambiguity, one appearing on the face of the deed, parole evidence is normally admissible to ascertain the party's intent. For example, one part of the deed states that it is conveying Blackacre, but later it purports to convey an interest in Whiteacre. Parole evidence is admissible to show which property the grantor intended to convey. Where the ambiguity is latent, not apparent on the face of the deed, parole evidence is generally admissible. For example, if A grants to B my house in San Francisco, parole evidence is admissible to show which house A owns. Compare inadequate description. If, however, A grants to B my house in San Francisco, and it turns out that A owns 3 houses in the city, the conveyance would probably fail for lack of adequate description. But note, if there is an underlying original agreement in which there was no mistake or ambiguity, and the only mistake was in the writing of the instrument, relief may be available by way of reformation of the deed. Rules of construction. Where there is a mistake or inconsistency in the description, as where the deed leaves in doubt the exact location of a property line or measurements give 2 different locations for the line, the following rules of construction are applied to carry out the party's probable intent. These are not rules of law and will not be applied where there is clear evidence showing a contrary intent. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 being natural monuments prevail over other methods of description, for example, artificial monuments, courses and distances, surfaces, acreage, or general descriptions. For example, a call from point X to the old oak tree prevails over a call from point X south 100 feet. 2. Artificial monuments, stakes, buildings, etc. prevail over all but natural monuments. And courses, angles, for example, angles prevail over distances. For instance, west 90 degrees to Main Street prevails over west 100 feet to Main Street. 4th and last, all of the foregoing prevail over general descriptions such as name, Walker's Island, or quantity being 300 acres. Letter E, land bounded by right-of-way. Title presumed to extend to center of right-of-way. If land is described as being bounded by a street, highway, or other right-of-way, or if the land conveyed is otherwise described but actually is bounded by such, there is a rebuttable presumption that the title of the grantee extends to the center of the right-of-way, assuming that the grantor owns to the center or to the full width of the right-of-way, assuming that the grantor owns to the center or to the full width of it if the grantor retains no adjoining land. This presumption accords with 1, Romanet 1, the presumed intention of the parties, and Romanet 2, the public policy that disfavors a grantor's retention of thin strips of land. A. Evidence to rebut presumption. In many jurisdictions, a description such as running along the street has been held sufficient to rebut a presumption that the grantee took title to the center. This is to be distinguished from the language bounded on the west by the highway, to which the presumption applies. But when the monument involved is a body of water, more definite language is necessary to rebut the presumption that the grantee takes title to the center, because unlike streets, there is no public rights in most bodies of water abutting on land, except possible navigation easements, and because a grantee of land adjoining water normally expects a right of access to the water. B. Measuring the monument. Notwithstanding the general rule, and unless a contrary intention is expressed, measurements from a right-of-way are presumed to start from the side and not the center. Again, this is based on the party's presumed intent. Number 2, in the land bounded by right-of-way section, A, B, and C. A, 2 is variable boundary line cases, and A is slow change in course changes property rights. B, avulsion does not change property rights, and C, encroachment of water does not change fixed boundary lines. All of this is relatively new to me, so I don't think it's going to be on the midterm. Nonetheless, for variable boundary line cases, A, slow change in course changes property rights. The slow and imperceptible change in course of a river or stream serving as a boundary operates to change a legal boundary. When land is described as abutting upon a body of water, any slow and imperceptible deposit of soil accretion belonging to the owner of the abutting land, the riparian owner, where accretion builds up in the regular pattern over the lands of several adjacent property owners, courts determine title to it in a just and equitable manner, either by Romanet 1 merely extending the property lines out into the water, and with each landowner getting the property that falls within the lines as extended, or Romanet 2 dividing up the newly formed land in proportion to the owner's interest in the adjoining land. Similarly, slow erosion of a stream's bank results in the owner losing title to the affected area. Avulsion, B, does not change property rights. A sudden perceptible change of a watercourse, avulsion, does not change property rights. Thus, if a river changes course suddenly, boundaries remain where they were, even if someone who formerly had river access now finds himself landlocked. C, encroachment of water does not change fixed boundary lines. According to the majority rule view, where property is encroached upon by a body of water, for example, lake enlarges, previously fixed boundary lines do not change the ownership rights, and ownership rights are not affected. Indeed, the boundary lines can still be proven even though the land is completely underwater. F, reformation of deeds. Reformation is an equitable action in which the court rewrites the deeds to make it conform to the intention of the parties. It will be granted if the deed does not express what the parties agreed to, either because of their mutual mistake or a scrivener's drafter's error. It will also be granted for unilateral mistake, but only if the party who is not mistaken induced the mistake by misrepresentation or some other inequitable conduct. If the property is passed to a bona fide purchaser who relied on the original language of the deed, the court will not reform it.